Hello, my name is James Armstrong and I'm a teacher of politics, and in this episode I'm going to be talking to you about one of the key thinkers for liberalism, this guy, John Rawls. So who is he? Well, John Rawls is, without doubt in my mind, the most important political philosopher of the 20th century. Rawls is born in 1921, he dies in 2002, and so he lives through a period that is politically, from the perspective of what he's interested in, engaging, interesting, and formative for him. He fights in World War II in the Pacific, and so fighting in that war, he obviously sees brutality and injustice, and that would mark him. He lives through the civil rights movement in America, so he sees the injustice of racial segregation, denying people the right to vote, and he sees police brutality. He sees the Vietnam War. He sees the student movement and the wider movement that develops around that war. And so the question that Rawls addresses, which goes back to the beginning of political philosophy, starting with Plato in the Republic, what does a just society look like? This question is not simply an academic question for Rawls. He is steeped in the question, as we all are, of what is justice. But I guess Rawls's approach to the question is quite parochial in some ways. When he writes about this, he's thinking about his own society. He lives in America. He's an American political philosopher. He spends his whole career teaching at Harvard University. And so he's looking at his own society, America, and he comes to the conclusion that America is not just, far from it. Rawls would go as far as to say that America is manifestly unjust. So he writes a book after a very long period of time. So he spends a lot of time thinking, reflecting, and he's 50 when he writes this book. So this is a very mature reflection on the world around him. The book is called A Theory of Justice, and it's published in 1971. And as I say, he's answering this question, what does a just society look like? And he says this right at the beginning. Justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is to systems of thought. Let's just think about what he's saying there. Justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is to systems of thought. Well, we'd reject a system of thought if it wasn't true. So, for example, 2 + 2 = 5. That was part of a system of thought. I would reject it. It's not true. Now, the same thing for Rawls is true of societies. If we examine the conventions, institutions, legal arrangements, unwritten rules, if we examine that bundle of things, which Rawls calls the institutional arrangements or the social structure, if we examine our societies in that way and we find that our institutions are not just, well, they either need to be changed or they need to be rejected. They certainly need to be rejected as just. Justice is the first virtue of social institutions. So it's that barometer, it's that measure of value, the justice or injustice of a society, that Rawls is interested in. But what we need to get a clearer idea of is what Rawls means when he says that a society is just. Now, he spends the first bit of the book rejecting some other answers to this question. For example, he rejects utilitarianism. I'm not going to go into that argument in a great deal of detail, but essentially his objection to utilitarianism is that it fails to take individuals seriously enough. And from his perspective, the aggregation of individual preferences, well, what does that do? It kind of erases the individual. It fails to take their rights seriously enough. And so he rejects other answers to that questions, including utilitarianism and intuitionism. And he situates himself in the social contract tradition. So he says that he's a social contract theorist, like, for example, John Locke or Thomas Hobbes, but that his version of the social contract is going to be much more abstract. He's going to do something with social contract theory that these previous political philosophers haven't done. Now, what he's interested in is trying to get a general agreement from people that live in society about what is meant by justice in order to form a social contract, in order to come to a general consensus about what justice is and what principles of justice would need to be applied to a society in order to say that a society is just. Now, if we imagine for a second that we convened society together, or a collection of society together in a meeting, say, and we tasked even a small group of people, let's say 30 people, you were tasked with coming up with some principles of justice. You've got to think about, well, what's going to get in the way of that? What's going to get in the way of us coming to an agreement? Well, we're going to come to the table with different ideological beliefs, different sets of values. We're going to have different characteristics that are going to influence what we think is just. Some of us are going to be rich, some of us are going to be poor. Some of us are going to be straight, some of us are going to be gay, some of us are going to be black, some of us are going to be white. In other words, our location in the social hierarchy is going to be different. Some of us are going to have a lot of wealth, power, and privilege. Others are not going to have that. Some of us are going to have very little wealth, power, and privilege. And so we can't come to a general agreement about something as important as justice if we're biased by those things. Rawls calls them arbitrary from a moral point of view. They're things that just happen to be the case about us by virtue of where we happen to be born, who we happen to be. And so Rawls says, look, if we're going to come to an agreement about justice, we can't be biased in this way. And he's got this device which he calls the veil of ignorance. And so what he says is, when we're thinking about questions of justice, we think of questions of justice from behind the veil of ignorance. And from behind the veil of ignorance, we don't know who we are, in the sense of not knowing where we fit in that hierarchy. So anything that would involve us being in a hierarchical relationship, we don't know about ourselves. So we don't know our socio-economic status. We don't know our gender. We don't know our sexuality or our race. We don't know anything about ourselves that would bias us or anything that would be arbitrary from a moral point of view. And so from behind the veil, he says, well, what sorts of principles would we come up with? And essentially he comes up with two principles of justice, which are actually three principles. Now, the first one is that we'd want to guarantee our liberty. He said that we'd want a system of basic liberties that are compatible with a like liberty for all. So we'd want to guarantee our freedom. And that is because Rawls would worry that we might come up with a set of principles that were prejudiced towards a particular group. So, if we came up with a set of principles that allowed racism and homophobia and sexism, and we lifted the veil and we found out that those discriminatory, illiberal policies affected us, well, that wouldn't be something that we'd be able to live with. And so Rawls thinks the first thing we'd want to do is guarantee freedom so that those things can't happen. Remember, Rawls is growing up in the civil rights era, right, where people's rights were not secure, where they had to fight for their rights, where they didn't have their rights, where black and white children went to different schools, where it took somebody like Rosa Parks refusing to get up off the bus to start a process of struggle that leads to civil rights legislation and Lyndon Johnson. So first of all, we'd want to guarantee our freedom. Secondly, Rawls says that we need to have what he calls fair equality of opportunity. So this is not the sort of equality of opportunity dreamed up by classical and neoclassical liberals, where they argue that we have equality of opportunity simply by virtue of the state getting out of the way and us living in a free market society. This is genuine equality of opportunity. So in other words, no matter where I am born in this social hierarchy, whether I'm right at the bottom or near the top, no matter what characteristics are true about me, again, whether I'm black or white, straight or gay, man, woman, it needs to be the case that I can have the opportunity to become what it is I want to become. So there are no barriers, there's no discrimination, there's nothing stopping me from being or becoming what I want to be or become. So this is a very modern view of what liberalism is about. It's about genuine equality of opportunity. And the third principle, the one that everybody talks about, called the difference principle, says that there's going to be inequality in the society, right? Because eliminating inequality for Rawls is not possible, at least within the sort of because I imagine the sort of Rawlsian system is going to still involve a market mechanism of some sort. He's still a liberal, he's not a socialist. So there's going to be some degree of inequality. But Rawls says this, he says, any inequality that exists needs to be justified to the least advantaged. And going back to the veil of ignorance and thinking about this for a second, well, why is this? And again, it's because when we've got the veil on, we don't know where we're going to fit in this social hierarchy. So we could be, for all we know, when we've got the veil of ignorance on, we could be that person at the bottom. And Rawls thinks that we're going to be risk averse, and that we're going to worry about that. We're going to think, I don't want to be at the bottom. And so what we're going to try and do is maximize the minimum. We're going to try and bring up those that are at the bottom by creating a principle of justice, the difference principle, that's going to mean that those at the top have to be able to genuinely justify the inequality that exists to those at the bottom. And so a Rawlsian society is going to be much, much more equal than the America that Rawls was living in. Actually, America's got more unequal since Rawls wrote The Theory of Justice. American society was actually much more equal in 1971 than it is now, because America's gone through the Reagan administration and what you might call the neoliberal experiment since then. So Rawls, if he thought that American society didn't live up to his standards in 1971, certainly wouldn't think that America lives up to his standards now. So that's what he thinks. And notice what Rawls manages to do. He manages to give us a theoretical framework, a thought experiment, if you will, the veil of ignorance, that allows us to think about what justice is. And then once we've got our conception of justice with these three principles, the liberty principle, the equality, the fair equality of opportunity principle, and the difference principle, that we can then apply those principles of justice to our society and ask the question, well, what would we need to change in order to make our society more just? So this is, or can be at least, pretty radical stuff. Radical in the sense that it demands that we do something about it. It demands that we change societies that aren't just. But Rawls is still a liberal. So most people, when they read Rawls, they read him as somebody that would want America to be more like Scandinavia, for example, than it is, a sort of neoliberal experiment. But he's not a socialist, right? So what he's not saying is, we need absolute equality. We need to redistribute wealth to create common ownership. So he's definitely a modern liberal, but he's a modern liberal that's going to be pushing really as far as modern liberalism can go. So what's that going to mean institutionally? Well, he doesn't actually give us that much clarity about what it would mean. But let me give you some suggestions as to the sorts of things that he'd be in favour of. Well, he'd be in favour of a taxation system that would be redistributive. So it would mean that if you were wealthy, you'd be paying a lot more tax than you currently do. There'd be a generous welfare system. Perhaps even some of the policies that we hear about more recently, things like a a minimum income, an income guarantee for those at the bottom of society, so you couldn't fall below a certain level. There'd definitely be public services provided that were generously funded. So this is going to involve a much larger role for the state. And so that's what makes him a modern liberal. So that's John Rawls, really important liberal thinker. Hopefully you have found that useful. Please like and subscribe.